Well, I think it's an extraordinary return, hard always to quantify with monetary values. I know in the commercial service, I was in the foreign commercial service for much of my career, we made an extraordinary effort to try to document our work with American business and the amount of money spent on it, and the return on investment was easily 20, 30 times what we were spending. I think in the broader area of diplomacy, the investment in having a corps of diplomats across the key countries of the world, in fact all of the countries of the world, that can both understand the setting and persuade and influence U.S. policy interests is extraordinarily important in lieu of the other alternatives when conflicts arise. Yes, it's very important, commercial diplomacy. I came into the Foreign Service in the early 1980s as the Foreign Commercial Service was being created based in the Commerce Department. We're a foreign service agency that is attached to almost all the major embassies overseas, our top 75 marketplaces. And it reflected, I think, the time we were in where the emphasis on economics and commercial was beginning to be ratcheted up as part of the post-World War II period, where immediately I think we were extraordinarily competitive in a range of industries and services, but found by the 1980s competition was increasing, and American firms, whether they were small businesses that did not have basic assistance to identify potential business partners, or larger companies that were running into competition from other countries' firms, there was a need to kind of strengthen and expand the programs and services we provided to the U.S. business community. I think it's been extraordinary from the very early days, looking back to the Revolutionary War period and not perhaps official diplomacy to the, I remember I was impressed when I was assigned to our embassy in London to see the very rich history of ministers and then ambassadors that represented U.S. interests between the United States and the United Kingdom. I think it's basically how countries do business with each other is often going to be channeled through those formal exchanges between governments. I think, as you probably have captured in other interviews, increasingly in my career, these became much more than government-to-government exchanges, but opportunities to understand and engage with a whole range of civil society and other organizations, both to capture reactions to U.S. policies and interests, but also to explain and persuade what our objectives really were. Well, for me, it was after graduate school and an interest in Latin America. I had been in an exchange program in Spain between high school and college, became very much interested in an international career. Began my career on a consultant contract at the Inter-American Development Bank, economics and then business. I was at the Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association on international trade issues, and realized that the Foreign Service had a really very attractive now new interest in the economic and commercial area, which was my area of specialization. And joined immediately and spent a wonderful career with both myself and my family in Latin America and Western Europe. Oh, it was extraordinary. And I know we celebrated the 90th anniversary of that this year here at the American Foreign Service Association. I think the recognition in 1924 of the need to have, as every other country in the world did, a professional service to represent our interests, to merge the consular corps and the diplomatic corps to provide a career path, to understand what the value and the earlier question about the return on investment was very important in our country's evolution. And over the last almost 100 years, it's been always an important effort to look at how to strengthen that commitment, how to expand our training programs, how to become more representative of our country in terms of diversity. And I've been very pleased to see the Foreign Service as an institution respond to all of those challenges. Very good point, because unlike some more traditional areas, the President speaking last night and others that are seen as political issues, we in the Foreign Service and the U.S. government don't make anything, don't make a product or sell it. So a lot of people might not understand that we play a very important role overseas in the embassies to assist some companies. Many companies that I worked with in my career did not have the capacity yet to identify opportunities for their product, They didn't have the capacity to, on their own, commercially figure out who they wanted to partner with. And we provided very useful links for them to have pre-qualified contacts with local firms to send back notices of where opportunities might be arising in this market. Again, these were often small and medium-sized firms, but sometimes just larger firms that, less now because of the internet, but in the earlier career, were not really aware of the opportunities they could take advantage of. That said, I think for much of our work, there were major efforts to help American global businesses compete and be effective in competing. Not being favored, but being allowed to have rules that were transparent, that they could play by, and they would have fair competition. So whether that's the Boeing versus Airbus issues on sales, or a whole range of technical and regulatory issues that had other intentions but might have hurt American business, we engage day to day in embassies across the world to ensure that rules protect safety and health and environment, but don't do so at the expense of allowing trade opportunities to take place. No, I appreciate that opportunity. It was, I think, a great indication of how good diplomacy on both sides, the European Union and the U.S., actually allowed all of us to achieve our objectives and to do so in a not political matter or not a matter that caused conflict. The short story is an important one in that the European Union, based in Brussels, their executive branch, the Commission, was looking to improve safety for young motorcycle bike riders. A very laudable objective. We have our own processes in this country to address the same issues. In doing so, they focused their regulation on the size of a motorcycle engine. And they placed that size at an interesting level that would only have affected one manufacturer, Harley Davidson, that if that rule had been passed as drafted, other competitors, I believe it was Honda and BMW, could have sold smaller engine-sized bikes to consumers, but Harley Davidson would have been taken out of the market. The issue was rising to a very high level where we were being asked, or almost being asked, to make a formal complaint to the European Commission, and because we were based on ground, had excellent relationships with the Commission, asked for some more time and used that time to really meet with the regulators at the Commission to understand their motives, talk to the Foreign Relations branch of the Commission to explain our interests, which is the safety of the young bike rider. We're able to bring some technical arguments to bear from our regulatory community and from Harley Davidson and from the European Manufacturers Association that explained that the biggest issue for safety for young riders was the ability of the rider to manipulate the engine capacity. And if we could address power and size ratios, that would be more effective than engine size. And then we removed ourselves from that discussion because the door had been opened by the regulators to listen to technical arguments. So I was very pleased that we took what could have become a political conflict that would have, I think, forced both sides to dig into a more formal complaint and have impact on companies and perhaps the broader economy, to actually help a European Commission regulator refine a better regulation for the safety the concerns they had, and one that did not have an impact on outside trading interests. So it was a very rewarding experience, and I think reveals that when you say commercial diplomacy or advancing U.S. commercial interests, if you do it right and are working carefully together with your counterparts in other countries, which is what diplomacy is all about, whether it's commercial or otherwise, you can really avoid many conflicts that arise because of the lack of trust, the lack of access, and the lack of respect for each other. It's not unique at all. I think Harley-Davidson stood out because of a variety of factors. The principal one, and I think it would apply in our own country, is that the awareness that the rulemaking was taking place happened very early in the process. It would be as if in our country the Federal Register had provided a notice and people were then aware of something and had the time to make their inputs known. Nothing was done here that was outside of the regulatory framework of another country's commission. I would recall in service in Latin America, under the Central American Free Trade Agreement, for example, in Honduras. There were a lot of opportunities that both governments had to understand the consequences of the commitments they'd made on market access, and again, not get into a conflictual relationship where people are retaliating against each other, but seek ways to both understand perspective and look for solutions that would allow the spirit of the agreement to go forward. So it's really part of the day-to-day, not perhaps stark and not all successful. Some issues actually become the most intractable are where the interests aren't so much about the safety and environment, but about protecting an industry or protecting a group of an economic interest. And the protection of the economic interest, if that's the driving motive, usually leads us into more difficult negotiations. No, I think I was thinking of one in Argentina where, but I think the one I would highlight is my time in London as the commercial minister had a very unexpected and very rewarding twist to it in that I was recalling the other day, it's been 20 years since we arrived in London, my wife and I, and it was the day we arrived was the last bomb from the IRA that went off in the city. And the peace process negotiations started with Northern Ireland and the IRA and Sinn Féin. And that's surprising that a commercial minister would mention that as one of my most rewarding moment areas, in that one of the important supporting mechanisms we had diplomatically to support the British and Irish government's effort to create a process to solve, finally, the long-standing dispute in Northern Ireland was commercial diplomacy. And I ended up spending, in the 4 years in London, more time than I ever would have imagined. I never thought I would be in Northern Ireland doing much, frankly. But showing with companies and investment opportunities there were substantial American business interests in Ireland. And also understanding the tremendous American investments that had been made in Ireland, again, related to the European Union marketplace, it became a very interesting demonstration effect to promote and reveal to the Northern Irish community, Protestant and Catholic, that peace would bring an entire new opportunity for investments to come to Northern Ireland. That clearly there were companies that were anxious to come to Northern Ireland, but the conflict was impeding them from coming there. And so we were very active. Secretary Ron Brown, who I'd worked with in Washington before going to London, later on Secretary Daley, as the head of the Commerce Department. It's maybe not that much appreciated story. Clearly this was a political negotiation between the British and Irish governments, and American diplomacy was supportive of the effort, clearly. And it's interesting to see how, again, from a business promotion point of view, there can be some very helpful demonstration effects as to what peace could bring to an area. So I think that would be the one I often reflect on. There was, no, it was in the Canary Wharf building. You're making me recall, there might have been, at some blip in the process, a smaller bomb, but kind of, I think it was August 22nd, 1994. I just remember because we had just landed in our temporary quarters and heard this bomb go off, and it became then you
were close enough to hear it.
Yeah, so we were just landing, and it was then the next day that I think announced that there was this process now that was going to start, and clearly took many years, but it was the commitment to not continue the violence while they were going to have this conversation about ending the violence and channeling the disputes in a political process and not a violent one. No, I appreciate that point. I mean, I highlight, and we all do probably, the wonderful advantages of the diplomatic career in terms of, for your own perspective, but for your children, and going to school overseas, international schools, meeting people from all over the world. Moving around is a disadvantage, particularly for families, as you're meeting friends and planting roots and then have to pick it up every 3 or 4 years. I would say the toughest part of the job was really that uprooting and moving. And then there were some, I'm recalling another moment now, difficult times when I was serving in Barcelona early in my career and was in the consulate trying to do some work at midday for a trade mission in town, our consulate was blown up. And in that process, fortunately, no one was killed. There were several wounded people, but clearly the trauma of that on your family. This was prior to cell phones and a range of other ways to alert, and we were about 6 hours before I could reconnect with my wife and children. And so I think that danger that the world was evolving into in the late 80s became more and more prevalent in our lives in the 90s and 2000s. That the embassies became much more aware of the need for security. You became much more aware of it, and I think that could have a bearing on just an awareness in the family side that produced certain levels of stress. I know, just talking to my son and daughter, who are now adults and married and living here in the area, fortunately, so we have more time to see each other again. They are always quick to reassure me that the positive much outweighed the negative, but they did recall how angry they were as children that they would have to leave behind their friends. Again, prior to the email, Facebook, and other social media pages, it was often leaving them not seeing much of them again. That's a great question. I know we started out talking about the state-to-state relationships, and that's kind of how diplomacy started, where ambassadors and embassies are communicating to the governments of a state about issues between the two states. There are now a whole range of very, very vital global issues, whether it's global warming, for example. So on global warming, clearly the capitals of the country are directly involved with each other at conferences. There are processes created to discuss proposals to be adopted. I think what I found very, very helpful is, when done well, is the embassies, the ambassador, and the team working on that issue were very intricately involved in the development of our proposal and in understanding the counter proposals that might be coming from the government we're working with. And again, the advantage one has on the job, whether it was the Harley Davidson example or global warming, is the relationships you have built that are going to be extraordinarily helpful for allowing you to understand why something is happening in the country you're in, how it affects the negotiations or the discussion of global warming. But if one was restricted to only having the capitals of the countries talking long distance to each other, it would not nearly be the rich and potentially positive discussion we can have to resolve some of these very, very important issues that go way beyond two countries talking or a group of countries talking, but are truly global. No, very good question, very tough question. I was recalling earlier joining the Foreign Service in the early 80s when an embassy didn't have any, the Marine was just standing behind a desk to let you in, and how much the world has changed since I guess the barracks bombings in Beirut in '82 and the rest. I think it's a risk management challenge that you have to manage carefully, but not so cautiously you isolate yourself from the population you're trying to address. I know in my case recently, where I was the acting Director General of the Foreign Commercial Service, we looked very carefully at what was needed in each place we had our staff, and finding out perhaps if a local employee could deliver that service, let's do that, and not because you're exposing the local employee, but because it might be a less visible attack symbol. And where do we need the American diplomatic officer? Where do we need good local employees that can assist companies? But I think there's nothing that's going to substitute for not being afraid and managing the risk, which would of course mean taking all the precautions, having the correct physical infrastructure. Clearly cybersecurity is perhaps as great a threat now as physical security threats, but the two together require that analysis, but not at the expense of figuring out how one can create the opportunity to live with and know the country's officials that you're dealing with, but increasingly, frankly, it's beyond country to country. It's how do you get an understanding of what's happening in the country you're living in? How do you talk to a range of groups and be able to do that and be safe? There's no magic bullet answer to that, but I know all of us that do this profession understand the risks physically and frankly, disease and other hardships that one goes through in certain markets, certain countries. But feels passionately about making sure we can still do that fundamental job. Well, yes. I mean, having cables that are meant for a certain audience um, and leaked is not a good experience to go through. I think looking back on it, I mean, I've heard a general sense that many people were impressed with the writing skills of the authors, and the actual understanding they were conveying in the cable is difficult as it is to have things that one has said about someone you're writing about read by that person, because that was not the intent, because you're providing advice to officials here. I think both that and some of the other leaks demonstrate the world we're now living in, where it's just accepting the technology and the access kind of will affect ultimately how one is probably communicating the information. But overall, it was particularly for those cables that were leaked where officials were still serving in their countries would be a very difficult situation. Wow. I think the one great challenge for the Foreign Service, and again, I remind the Foreign Service is an accepted service, like the military. It is recruited in a very special way. There's a merit-based examination system. There are hierarchical levels to go through. You are promoted up and out. You are automatically retired if you aren't. So there's a range of things that distinguish this institution from others. I think, as any institution that's now 90 years old, one always fights the challenge of staying in the past and looking backwards. And I think we face, as professional career diplomats, the constant need to kind of look forward. I mentioned, the nostalgia, perhaps, of an embassy that you could just walk into and you had no fax machine, you had a cable box that was pleasant to be able to work and not have too many people bothering you from outside of the Capitol. From the fact that we are now in this hyperactive, very connected world, and that's good. And so let's make sure we go forward as that institution. So the constant need to modernize and professionalize in today's world looking forward is always going to be a challenge, but particularly so as the President has spoken about the new order that's arising in the middle of all the difficult issues that we find in the world today, and with the technology, whether that's talked about as leaked cables or just the way that we can now communicate on social media, and there's such an active program, I know, at the State Department and social media and others, that all of that has to get factored into the continuing training, recruitment, and development of new career Foreign Service officers. And I would hope a renewed commitment to a career Foreign Service. I think it's been a struggle in recent years, perhaps, to maintain the idea that a career Foreign Service is a vital resource with a wonderful return on investment that needs to constantly be invested in and modernized and adapted for the future.